speech in Chicago, towards the end of the 1990s. And I always had the view that, of course, you had to be incredibly careful doing this. And sometimes, my ideas on these things are somewhat distorted, so that people think, I was in favor of intervening everywhere. I'm not. But in Sierra Leone, for example, we were, if you've seen the film Blood Diamond, then you will know what was happening in Sierra Leone at the time. And this was a situation in which a group of gangsters basically were going to take over the democracy of the country. We had the opportunity to send, it wasn't very many actually, I think it was a couple of thousand British troops in to do the job of preventing them doing so, which they did. And today I now work in Sierra Leone actually as part of my Africa initiative. And this is a country, okay, it's still poor, but it's making progress. And so, I think that there can be circumstances in which you can intervene. I think if Rwanda happened again, not that it will in Rwanda, but if the similar situation happened elsewhere, I hope very much we would intervene. But, it's difficult. These are very difficult interventions to make.
It concludes that Iraq has chemical and biological weapons, that Saddam has continued to produce them, that he has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons, which could be activated within 45 minutes, including against his own Shia population.
Tony Blair, in 2002, reporting on intelligence that he'd seen on the threat posed by the then Iraqi president, Saddam Hussein. I spoke with Tony Blair on the release of his memoir called A Journey.
Were you ever worried about the quality of the information that was being brought to you about the situation in Iraq?
No, I can't say I was really, because, one of the things about Iraq that people should always remember is that, it wasn't a coincidence that people were worried about Iraq. I mean, Saddam had used chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war, which had 1 million casualties. He'd used chemical weapons against his own people. There were thousands killed in one day in a village, a Kurdish village, through the use of chemical weapons. And if you talk to some of the survivors there, you just realize how horrific it was. He had to have military action taken against his nuclear facilities at an earlier stage. And President Clinton and I, the first military action actually I ever took was with President Clinton in respect of Iraq. So it wasn't really surprising. And I think now that we see, what the Iraq Survey Group showed after the Iraq War ended, it's pretty obvious what happened, which is that he decided to get rid of the physical evidence, but retained both the intention and indeed the know-how. So I think, the faults in intelligence are now fairly easily explicable, but what actually went wrong in Iraq and why it was then very, very challenging and very difficult was not so much getting rid of Saddam, because that took 2 months, but what happened afterwards when these external forces, Al-Qaeda on the one hand, Iran on the other, came in to try and destabilize the situation.
We know now, with the benefit of hindsight, that Colin Powell, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, had grave doubts about the intelligence, and that was one of the reasons why George Tenet sat behind him when he delivered the evidence that was given to him regarding Iraq to the United Nations. Were you aware of Colin Powell's doubts at the time about the quality of the intelligence given about weapons of mass destruction?
No, but I should say that Colin himself would be the first to say, whatever doubts or questions there were, he didn't question the basic premise, which no one questioned, and that's why the UN resolution in November 2002 was unanimous, and that was predicated on the basis that Saddam had WMD because, as I say, he'd used them, he'd been in breach of UN resolutions, and he wasn't cooperating with the inspectors. And one of the mysteries of this is that if he actually didn't have any WMD, why on earth refuse to cooperate with the inspectors? And of course, as I say, the reason for that is now clear, which is that what he didn't want to do was to allow his key people to be interviewed, because if they had been interviewed, then it would have been clear that this was not this was not something that he was going to give up.
Hans Blix, the leader of the UN team that went in search of Saddam's weapons of mass destruction before the beginning of hostilities, has said in response to your comments in the book, I'm quoting him here, he says, "The war was sold on the weapons of mass destruction, and now you feel or hear that it was only a question of deployment of arguments." As he said, it sounds a bit like a fig leaf that was held up, and if the fig leaf had not been there, then they would have tried to put another fig leaf there. What would you say to Hans Blix's Hans Blix's comments there, Tony Blair.
It's just, I mean, it really is. As I had this debate with him at the time, and he rather forgets the time he was coming to see me and saying, "Look, I can't get interviews with the key people in Saddam's regime," and I was saying to him, "Well, you've got to, because this is the only thing that will tell us what's going on." And he would say to me, "But I'm afraid they're going to be murdered if they start cooperating with me." And I was saying to him, "Well, what does that show you about the nature of the people we're dealing with?" I mean, the issue, because you've got the same question in respect of Iran today, which is what makes these questions very difficult, and why I think it's so wrong if this whole debate is framed in a way of sort of lies versus truth. The fact is, after September the 11th, the whole calculus of risk for me changed completely on the WMD issue, because my view was that the people who killed 3,000 innocent civilians on one day in New York, if they could have killed 30,000 or 300,000, they would have. And therefore, you couldn't afford to let these groups get hold of WMD. Therefore, your attitude to proliferation and enforcement of UN resolutions on this subject had to change dramatically. Now that's, if you go back and wind back to 2002, 2003, that was the thing that was motivating us. And the issue today, incidentally, as President Obama's quite rightly said in respect of Iran, is not simply Iran with a nuclear weapon. It's what happens if there is leakage or dissemination of know-how or technology to these terrorist groups. That's the issue, and it's about risk in the end. It's not truth versus deceit. It's a calculation of risk.
The evidence about Saddam having actual biological and chemical weapons, as opposed to the capability to develop them, has turned out to be wrong. I acknowledge that. I accept it. And the problem is that I can apologize for the information that turned out to be wrong. But I can't sincerely, at least, apologize for removing Saddam.
In the upshot of the war, the price has been very high, over 100,000 casualties, anything between that and 600,000, depending on which report you want to accept on that matter. Thousands of fatalities amongst coalition soldiers as well. Al-Qaeda was not in Iraq, as it turns out, beforehand, but they were certainly there after the invasion. The Taliban resurgent in Afghanistan, American prestige seriously troubled by all this. Are you prepared to consider the thought that many people, I'm sure, are putting to you in these interviews, that the price was too high?
Well, it depends what the price, what is exacted the price in a sense. I mean, incidentally, just on the casualties, I mean, the figure of over 100,000 is now the International Red Cross figure. And this figure of 600,000 was a figure that is now totally discredited. And incidentally, of that 100,000,
that was from the Lancet, though. That was from the British medical the Lancet, I believe. That figure.
I know, but the methodology that they used has now been shown to be faulty. Now, the original publication got a lot more publicity, believe it or not, than the subsequent analysis that showed it was based on the wrong methodology. No, the fact is, I mean, look, whether it's 100,000 or it's